Good evening. My name's Evan, and welcome to Rocklin Graves. With my Halloween Ends review, I'm finally through making videos about all of the ones canon in the latest timeline, and I do plan on reviewing the rest of the franchise at some point, but I figured for now I could do a ranking since Ends has had a year to settle in. Out of all the major horror franchises, Halloween is the one that means the most to me. It's the one that I have the most emotional stock in, so bear that in mind while I go through these. And another thing is that I'd ask you keep in mind that you're probably not going to agree with where I've placed a number of these movies, and that's okay. If we all agreed on every movie, then there would be no point in discussing them. So if you feel like I've got a completely messed up, ass-backwards ranking, that's totally fine. Leave your ranking in the comments. Just be civil.
I ain't telling you to be Michael Myers. I'm playing Michael Myers.
My two least favorite entries in this franchise bounce around the bottom spot depending on what day you ask me. And there's a part of me that would like to be a little more interesting and put the other one at number 13, but honestly, Resurrection is the only one that truly deserves that spot. It doesn't feel like anyone involved with it understood what it is that draws fans to a Halloween movie, because it's essentially just a generic early 2000s slasher with a scarecrow Michael Myers. The mask is far from the worst in the series, and there's actually a pretty decent recreation of the Myers house, but don't let that trick you into thinking that this is something made for fans. Resurrection was forced out after the success of Halloween H2O and completely shits on the great ending that movie had. Blair Witch Project was all the rage at this time, so a found footage element was shoehorned into this movie with Dangertainment, an online livestream network run by Busta Rhymes and Tyra Banks. Michael is an absolute bitch in Resurrection, save for one cool kill, and this movie is home to one of the most infamously terrible lines in horror.
Trick or treat, motherfucker.
Yeah, Trick or Treat. The franchise is now dead until it gets remade. I will admit, I can still be entertained by this movie while in brain-off mode, but remember, I'm a sucker for this franchise, and I can have a good time with any of them, but that doesn't mean this isn't a dog shit movie.
Michael, go home! Go home!
The reason that Resurrection and Halloween 5 seem to be constantly fighting for my bottom spot is because, well, Resurrection is an insultingly stupid entry that is suffocatingly stupid. Often, when I put on Halloween 5, I'm just bored. There's a sort of giallo feel to this movie that, it makes sense because it was from a European director, and that is interesting, but Halloween 5 stumbles in almost every step it takes. It really ruins the end of Halloween 4, which is one of the best and most chilling endings to a horror movie. That also seems to be a theme, where you have a really good sequel and then a shit movie that destroys the ending of the last one. And the way that this handled the returning characters was just ridiculous. Rachel is unceremoniously killed off early on, so us lucky ducks get to spend time with Tina. Fucking great. It's got the worst mask of the franchise by a country mile. Yes, I hate it more than the 1 in 4. That just looked like a shitty Michael Myers mask. This looks like an alien had one too many tequila shots and then got caught trying to herd sheep in the countryside. I'm not much of a fan of Don Shanks' Michael, but it's definitely not the worst. I feel bad for the dude because he was given such bizarre instructions for the performance. I think I remember him saying that the director told him something like, "I want you to move like wood through water." Huh? Loomis is batshit crazy at this point, and that can be really entertaining, but this is just a boring movie to me. There are some good sequences, like in the laundry chute, and that shows some promise, but then you have things like Michael fucking crying in the quote-unquote Myers house that they didn't even attempt to give any sort of continuity to. It also set up the Man in Black, but they didn't even know who this was or what the tattoo on Michael's wrist was when they made the movie. It's an unfinished script that was executed really poorly, and it's the most boring entry in the whole franchise in my opinion. I get that it has its fans, and I can appreciate things like the scene where Loomis is calling off into the misty woods, but I don't revisit this one very often.
It's raining red. Mommy, it's raining red.
I actually hadn't even seen the theatrical version for a long time, but I feel pretty much the same way about both cuts, so I figured I'd just give them one spot on the list. I like the producer's cut better because it's a more cohesive story, and the editing doesn't feel like a made-for-TV slasher from the early 2000s, but I will say, If you're looking for the gorier version, this is a rare case where the theatrical version is substantially more violent. There's a lot in Halloween 6 that I really don't think gets enough credit, like the look and feel that actually gives off a strong Halloween tone. Michael's also pretty good here, with George P. Wilbur making his second appearance as the character, and he does a great job, so Michael's awesome, the atmosphere is there, but it's the plot that I cannot get on board with. Having Michael be driven to kill because of an ancient curse based on constellations is so ridiculously out of tune with the way he was set up in the first movie, and once all the cult stuff gets revealed, the movie just gets silly. Then in the producer's cut, you've got that whole plot line with Michael impregnating his niece and then trying to get the baby. It's just goofy. You get a bizarre performance from Paul Rudd as Tommy, who grew up just obsessed with learning about the curse of Michael. I like Loomis a lot more in this movie than Halloween 5, but I'm always sad when the movie ends because Donald Pleasance died before it was released, and this was his last movie.
Not dead. Just very much retired.
Such an icon. The theatrical version is better if you're just in the mood for a brutal slasher movie, but if you want any sort of coherent story, go for the producer's cut. I cannot believe that I'm even calling the producer's cut coherent, but compared to the theatrical version, it is. They're both insane, so don't worry. It comes down to the vibe of this movie for me. It's a great one to watch in the dark during October with a few candles on, and as silly as it is, I do have a good time with it. I've had a weird relationship with this movie over the years. It was one of the first movies that I was explicitly told I was not allowed to watch as a kid that I went behind my parents' back and watched anyway, and back then, I did like it. Now, I realize that's probably just because it was really brutal, and that's exciting when you're younger because it feels forbidden. Rob Zombie's Halloween is very distinctly split up into 3 parts, and I like each one more than the last. The first act is pretty atrocious, you know, that's when you're getting the absolute worst of the worst Rob Zombie dialogue with that ridiculous breakfast scene.
Bitch, I will crawl over there and I will skull fuck the shit out of you!
Oh, I'll get the crutches for you.
There's some brutal shit in that first act, but outside of that, there's not much I like about it. The scenes with Loomis and Michael in the asylum are actually pretty good, but at the end of the day, I just don't want to see a young Michael in this much detail. The second act is better when Michael's grown up, but every time I watch this, I'm really just waiting for the third act where it basically turns into a more gritty and gory version of the original movie. The look of Michael is one of the best, but I've always found the aging on the mask looks too fake. The design itself is really good though, and matches the overall feel of the movie. And speaking of that, the tone is really solid. Like, this feels like a great movie to watch around Halloween. Those exterior shots with the lawn decorations and the nice blowing leaves everywhere. It's surprising that in a franchise called Halloween, there are so many entries that didn't really achieve the feeling of Halloween, but this one does that better than a lot of them did. Scout Taylor Compton's take on Laurie is very different, but I think that's good because no one can do it like Jamie Lee Curtis. If I was just looking at the third act, this movie would be a hell of a lot higher up than this, but it's the first act in particular that really drags it down. It is nostalgic for me though, because I saw it when I was younger, so I do have somewhat of a soft spot for it, and I tend to get the urge to watch it every October. Definitely go for the theatrical cut though, because it doesn't have that ridiculous escape scene and the ending doesn't get stretched out as much. I should remind you, even these movies at the bottom spots are not movies that I hate. I don't hate a single Halloween movie. I can acknowledge that a lot of them are really bad, but I still love them. They all have a very dear spot in my heart.
Maybe. Some night by a warm fire.
Halloween 20, 20 years later. Good title. Look, there are things I like about this movie. I enjoy the focus on characters. I think it's the most realistic portrayal of where Laurie would be after what happened in 1978, and it does have one of the best moments of the entire franchise. That gives me chills every single time, but where this movie really falls for me is that it needed more Halloween in it. It takes place in California at a private school, so the small Midwestern suburbs feel isn't there anymore, but the biggest sin to me is the score. It's not bad music, but it's terrible for a Halloween movie. The soundtrack to this franchise is absolutely vital to the feel, and the generic orchestral horror music does absolutely nothing to make this feel like a Halloween movie. There's a generation of people who had this as their first theater experience for a Halloween movie, and I can absolutely see why you'd love it so much if that's the case, but I don't have that same nostalgia for it. I've never been drawn to the Kevin Williamson feel of H2O either, and it just makes it feel like they were trying to use Scream to hoist the Halloween franchise up after it was in the gutter. I'm not the biggest Scream fan, so this doesn't do a thing for me, but all that being said, this is one of the stronger narratives in a Halloween film, and the third act is pretty great. Chris Duran's Michael is decent, although I've never been much into the way he's used a lot of the time, and the whole situation with the masks is just ridiculous. I know there are a lot of people who have this movie as their headcanon ending for the franchise, and I can see why, but I've always felt the ending was too abrupt for how much time the movie spent on Laurie's character. It's cool, but it doesn't feel nearly as satisfying for me as it clearly does for most people. It's one of the best written entries in the series, but for what I look for in a Halloween movie, there just isn't much for me to grab onto. I had a feeling I'd be upsetting people with this video. Usually, when you ask someone what the worst Halloween movie is, their answer is either Resurrection or Rob Zombie's Halloween 2, but I'm on a dwarf planet of people who really like this movie. There are certain things I like more about Rob Zombie's first Halloween movie, but overall, I like the sequel a lot better. It's a really unique take on the formula, which is something I'm always a fan of so long as it's done in a compelling way, and the gritty feel of this one has always worked for me. If you're gonna do something different, go for it and commit to it. This is just a gruesome grindhouse movie with this strange, dreamy atmosphere, and I really do think it gets too much hate. There is some dumb shit, though. The White Horse is gobbledygook made up to give the movie a pseudo-psychological element, and they try to justify it with a quote that they made up at the start of the movie. It doesn't work like that! The terrible dialogue makes its expected return, and Loomis is changed from the morally ambiguous man from Rob Zombie's first movie to a full-fledged, self-centered asshole prick muncher. You'll be noticing a trend here, because once again, it's the feel that makes this movie work for me. I've always stood by that Rob Zombie is a good director. He's just not a very good writer. The scene in the cornfield is absolutely fantastic, and the way it's shot makes it one of the most memorable moments of the series. The ending is insanely weird, and I do not acknowledge Michael speaking in the director's cut. Get that the fuck out of here! The two cuts are pretty different, mostly because Laurie's a lot more sympathetic in the theatrical version. This is a weird movie that does not feel anything like a traditional Halloween film, but the tone that it does have works really well for me, and this is battling with Halloween Kills for the most intimidating Michael Myers.
Happy Halloween.
Another unique entry for this franchise, Halloween 3 would be an 80s horror classic in the same way a lot of Carpenter's films are if it didn't have the Halloween name attached to it. This is one that was absolutely hated when it came out, but people have really started to come around to it in the decades since, and that's because it's a fucking awesome 80s horror movie. This wasn't directed by John Carpenter, but you can tell how closely Tommy Lee Wallace worked with Carpenter because it really does feel in line with something he'd direct. This is an annual must-watch for me because it gets so much right for a movie to watch around October. You've got the small town in the countryside lorded over by this mysterious Bond villain with a secret plan to kill every kid in the world on Halloween night as a sacrifice for the ancient traditions of Samhain that have been lost to time, and in comes Tom Atkins slinging dick and kicking evil's ass while drinking a sixer. What more can you possibly ask for? You want them to steal Stonehenge? You got it. Want to see Tom Atkins punch green goo out of a robot's chest cavity? It's all here, baby. And on top of all that, the music is S-tier John Carpenter. Halloween 3 feels like an R-rated episode of Goosebumps, and I love pretty much everything about it, although I'm sure no one around me loves it when that fucking jingle gets stuck in my head like it does at least 3 times a year.
Happy, happy Halloween, silver shamrock.
And you also get one of the best endings of the franchise. I'm so glad this movie's getting more love these days, and is not leaving my annual rotation anytime soon. This is the one that jumps around the most on my list depending on my mood. It's unintentionally become a bit of a comfort movie for me because I like to try and save the original for Halloween night, so when I'm feeling down and feel like seeing that movie, I'll always grab Halloween 2, and it does scratch that itch. In terms of feel, it's the closest thing to the first movie by a long shot, but when you consider Rick Rosenthal also directed Halloween Resurrection, it makes you wonder how much John Carpenter was micromanaging on this set to save the movie. There's a really cold, creepy feel to the scenes outside, and especially the scenes inside the Barron Hospital, and I've always adored the gothic flair that Carpenter added to the score this time around. There's a bit of a double-edged sword to this movie, feeling so similar to the first in a lot of ways. One side is that the original movie is fantastic, and these two work really well as a double feature, but it also feels like it's spinning its wheels a lot and was made out of obligation, which it was. John Carpenter didn't want to make this movie, and he's been really harsh on it ever since. I can see why, but there's a lot of great stuff in Halloween 2. The atmosphere is absolutely top-notch, and it's really well directed. It does away with a lot of the subtlety from the first in favor of a more Friday the 13th approach to try and catch some of the waves that movie was making in the early 80s, but to be fair, there are some great kills as a result of that. Dick Warlock plays Michael in this movie, and I've always found his performance to be too robotic for my taste. The best way I've found to describe Michael is cat-like, but here the performance is too sterile. The mask is the same from the original, but it was already coming apart and it fit Dick Warlock's head very differently, but it's a look that I still like. Laurie barely does anything except sleep for most of the movie, but Loomis gets more time to shine, and that's always a good thing.
What is it you fellas usually do? Fire a warning shot, right?
I love Halloween 2, but I don't think it justifies its existence very well, and it established a brother-sister plotline that took the franchise into a downward spiral after a while.
Michael. God damn you.
This is the best of the classic Halloween sequels, and depending on the day, it could be the only one I'm in the mood to watch. This thing just bleeds atmosphere with the foggy Halloween night and this beautiful use of those deep blue tones. Rachel and Jamie have one of the best dynamics in the entire franchise, with Rachel being this reluctant older stepsister who's forced to love Jamie like their blood when things get dangerous. Danielle Harris is insanely good for how old she was at the time, and Rachel is such a good final girl. However, the reason this movie isn't an easy win for me is simple. I don't like how Michael is handled on screen in this movie, for the most part. There are some great stalking moments that elicit the boogeyman we know from the original, but he looks absolutely ridiculous, and it gets in the way of so much of the potential impact of this movie. The mask looks like someone who saw the original back when it came out, had a dream about the movie last week, and tried to recreate how their hazy mind remembered the mask out of melted plastic. And then you've also got the shoulder pads that make Michael look like a toddler at his parents' bedroom after he threw up in the middle of the night. That's really silly, but I do love the idea of him like dismantling Haddonfield's infrastructure piece by piece to set the stage for what he's there to do, taking down the phone lines and the police station. Also, the bandaged face is awesome, and that scene in the gas station is a series highlight. Then you've got the ending. Oh my god. It's absolutely bone-chilling and would have made for the perfect ending to this timeline, so I tend to just ignore 5 and 6 and pretend that this is where the story ends. Love the characters, love the story, and the vibes are immaculate, but it's just Michael's on-screen presence that holds it back for me.
Wait, hang on. I don't have my stethoscope.
I should preface by saying that, like many of you who saw Halloween H2O as their first Halloween movie in a theater, Halloween 2018 was mine. I was 16 when it came out, which is the same age that my dad was when the original came out, and we went on release night 40 years later, and we saw all of the trilogy on the nights they came out, so there's a lot of sentimentality there. Halloween 2018 did so much right in terms of delivering a good legacy sequel, and it's the movie that really set off the trend that's still going because it was so damn successful. This felt like a movie that best understood what Halloween was when it came out, and you can tell that it's made by people who really loved the franchise. First off, I was so happy to see the sibling relationship done away with so that Michael could return to being this ambiguous killer again, and while I think H2O had a more realistic portrayal of Laurie, the sort of Sarah Connor badass that Laurie is in this movie is awesome. The cast of characters overall is great, and while not all of the humor lands, there are some moments of it that I think work really well.
If I had some other kind of babysitter, she'd be reading me a story. I wouldn't be up clipping my nasty ass toenails.
Go to bed.
James Jude Courtney has become my favorite Michael of any sequel. It happened pretty much immediately, and God, if I only knew this wasn't even the peak. Halloween 2018 is truly a love letter to the franchise, but It also does its own thing and delivered a Halloween sequel that feels fresh while sticking to the roots of what made the franchise so good. Then there's the score, which is just perfection. I remember my dad saying that he was like nodding off halfway through the movie, but once The Shape Hunts Allison blared up, he was locked in, and it topped all of the other sequels for him. That's a moment in the theater I'll never forget. I would have liked to see more of Halloween stalking around in the background, but I've always felt like this timeline's Michael felt the most like a natural progression of the character. This would have made a great 1-2 punch with the original movie, but it was really well received and did well at the box office, so there was still more to come. The long one-shot of Michael on Halloween night embodies so much of what I love about that night and these movies, and it would easily make a list of the best moments in the franchise were I ever to make such a video. Also, the opening credit sequence is just fantastic.
You're a hero with your struggles, and ask anyone. I'm the psycho babysitter. I'm the fucking kid killer.
Here we go. At the time of recording this, I haven't released my Halloween Ends review yet, so I have no idea what sort of response it'll have, but I'm well aware that most people absolutely hate this movie, and I also completely understand why. This was not what people wanted from Halloween Ends, and it's also not what was promised in the marketing, but in the years since it came out, I went from liking it to getting angry every time I thought of it, and then shooting right up to a love fest. I think I've made it pretty clear that I like when these movies do weird shit, and Halloween Ends was the first entry that's fully explored an idea that so many slasher movies have toyed with but never really went through with. Hell, even Halloween 4 set up a similar idea. After 2018 and Kills, this movie scales things back and takes a more intimate look at the characters and the scars that Michael left Haddonfield with, and the way this movie handled that darker and more emotional material worked so well. It's much more of a character study than anything else, but at the end of the day, that's not what people bought their tickets for. For me though, this has so much of what I want in a Halloween movie while doing something wildly different and fresh that was such a ballsy move, especially for its positioning in this trilogy. I have a lot of respect for Blumhouse giving everyone the creative freedom to make a movie like this, and I'm glad they did because I truly love the result. The tone of Ends absolutely nails the small Midwest town and Halloween feel. It's absolutely beautifully shot. It's the best written of the trilogy, and as with 2018, the score is top-notch. It might be even better overall. There are so many little details that make me appreciate it more every time I watch it, but it's not just the character drama and the tone that I enjoy. Corey's killings have a very different flavor than Michael's do. They're a lot more unhinged, and scenes at the junkyard are series highlights. The opening of the movie is probably my favorite since the original, and the epilogue has some of my favorite minutes of the entire franchise. It's messy, and it's an insane curveball, but it's one that I'm glad they took because it's such an interesting, atmospheric, emotional ride that I seem to love more every time I watch it. People say this doesn't feel like a Halloween movie, and I couldn't disagree more. There's a reason this is the only sequel that John Carpenter has praised in the way he did, because it's genuinely fresh while maintaining the spirit of that first movie. I just put out a massive review for Halloween Ends, so if you're at all curious to hear me go into excruciating detail about why I think it's great, then make sure to check that out. If I love Halloween Ends for being bold and unique and emotional, Halloween Kills is a thrill ride roller coaster that just gives my Halloween fanboy brain the ultimate love letter. I did not like this movie when it came out, but since then it's climbed way up my list for a few reasons. Firstly, this is the most badass that Michael Myers has ever been by a long shot. The half-charred mask is so fucking cool, and James Jude Courtney might have given himself the title of Best Michael Myers with this one. He's just so brutal and creepy, but what I really love is that Kills brought back that strange playful nature that Michael had in the first movie. He'd display his victims, he'd curiously look at what he'd done, and that's an element to the character that was kind of left behind for a lot of this franchise. This is the boogeyman in full force, but not in the same way he was in the original. This is what happens when you try to burn the boogeyman, and now he's set loose on this fire-fueled rampage that's an absolute blast to watch. Then you've got the flashback scene, which showed that a period piece Halloween movie in the 80s is absolutely possible with the right budget, because this sequence is so convincing. I really enjoy the side characters like Big John and Little John that are just so unorthodox for these kinds of movies. The music, once again, it's incredible, and I'd have a really hard time picking between these three soundtracks. They're they're all just absolute perfection. The hospital stuff is where most people's gripes with the movie focus on, but guess what? People act dumb when mob mentality comes into play, and especially since so many people here have been drinking all night and there's this insanely gruesome rampage getting worse by the minute, I have no trouble believing that they'd get caught up in the fervor and lose any rational thought. They see a man in a Smith's Grove outfit and that's all it takes. Mobs are stupid, and that's the point. Halloween 4 introduced the mob in a much smaller scope, but I love this grandiose idea of the whole town of Haddonfield hunting down Michael while he's just off playing somewhere else, completely unaware of the pandemonium he's caused. Then you've got the feel of this movie, which is just a piece of candy for me as a Halloween fan, with that deep blue coming back in full force and the great set design and the decorations littering the lawns. Now, with the context of what happens in Halloween Ends, I love Kills even more because it's the final night of the boogeyman on one last hurrah, and the huge scope of this rampage makes that feel really impactful and fitting, and that also recontextualized Tommy's efforts with the mob because we know now that they didn't die in vain. I'd be here for a long time if I broke down everything I love about Halloween Kills, so go check out my review if you want something more exhaustive, but now it's time to move on to the #1 spot, and I mean, you already know what it's gonna be.
The blackest eyes. The devil's eyes.
They'd need to come up with some otherworldly Halloween movie to top this one, but even then, I just don't see it happening. It came out 45 years ago, and there's still nothing quite like it. It's an incredibly simple story that was executed masterfully by someone who understood how to take a simple concept and elevate it with music, cinematography, pacing, and lighting in a way that no one else really has. Without Halloween, there's no big slasher boom of the 80s. Can you imagine? John Carpenter and Deborah Hill brought to life this eerie and densely atmospheric horror movie that didn't take place out in a castle in the middle of nowhere, it took place in your backyard. It wasn't the first one to do something like that, but there are no other movies that I can think of where the town just transforms into this eerie, otherworldly ghost town, at least not in the same way. Michael Myers is a ghost, appearing and disappearing in the dark and moving like a cat playing with its prey, and that's what made him so scary. He just showed up. No one knows what drew him towards Laurie, and it has my favorite ending to any horror movie. We've got all these sequels, some of them are great and really feel like they get it, and some of them I'd easily say I love, but at the end of the day, if you just watch the original Halloween, you don't need anything else. It's this incredible, isolated movie that starts off slow and quiet with this strange, motiveless stalker, and then culminates in one of the best 15-minute chunks of horror that I can possibly imagine. I have not missed watching it on Halloween night for, I think, 10 years now, and I'll continue doing so for the rest of my life. So there you have it. I know I've probably pissed some people off with this ranking, but I don't care, because that's how I feel about these movies. Halloween is my favorite horror franchise, even with some of the dog shit entries, so I'm glad to finally have done a ranking for it to put my thoughts to paper on these movies. Eventually, I'll do full reviews for every entry in the franchise, but I do have videos you can watch on the original movie and the 3 entries in the newest timeline, but just so you know, I made most of those while I was still getting my bearings on how to make videos for this channel, and it shows. Thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.